From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters.
Canada and the United States have once again agreed to extend by 30 days until July 21st the current measures in place along our border.
Later this month, the border closure agreement between Canada and the U.S. is set to expire. But ask yourself this question: would you want the border to open up right now? For most Canadians, it's not really a debate. It's an overwhelming no. A Nanos Research public opinion poll published this month showed 81% of Canadians are in favor of keeping the Canada-US border closed. The COVID situation in the two countries are heading in polar opposite directions.
The U.S. set a new record, more than 60,000 new cases in a single day. 37 states are seeing an increase in new infections as the situation grows worse in the South and West.
The United States has more than 3 million confirmed cases, averaging more than 50,000 new cases every day for the past week. It has the world's worst death toll, with more than 130,000 people dead and counting. Even when you adjust for population size, the differences are stark. Canada has about 2,800 cases per million people. The US more than triples that figure at about 9,000 cases per million. The virus is spreading at a rapid clip in states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California. The curve in the United States did plateau for about a month, but now it's rising again. Today, we're talking about the world's longest undefended border with Canada's most important ally. How long should the border be closed? And when will it reopen again? Ed Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief, joins us to break it all down. Ed, thanks for joining us.
No problem. It's my pleasure. It's good to hear a voice from home.
So, I wanted to know what it's like to live in Washington, D.C. during this pandemic, watching those case numbers rise every day. What is that like living in the U.S. right now?
I don't mean to laugh when you ask that question, but it's fascinating and exhausting and sometimes a little bit scary. But for a journalist, you couldn't ask for, more stories. You could maybe ask for less or for them to be spaced out over more time. The pandemic is a huge topic of conversation. It's a huge topic of political debate. It doesn't feel day to day like the kind of existential threat or, the fear isn't as great as it might be right now if you lived in Florida or Arizona or Texas, where cases have, of course, spiked through the roof, where deaths are starting to climb fairly precipitously. And in some places, particularly in Florida.
Hospitals here in Florida are really at the tipping point. We are learning that most Florida hospitals are operating around 80% capacity right now. In counties like Miami-Dade, where things are worse, they're operating closer to 90%.
Where governments seem dedicated to sort of not responding in the ways you might want them to respond by strengthening social distancing guidelines, mandatory mask orders, all of that kind of thing. That's particularly scary. And so for my family and I, who've been isolating in our homes, working from home, staying at home outside of, trips to the park and whatnot for months now, you don't get the sense here that the pandemic is raging across our neighborhood or anything like that. But certainly the wider situation in the United States is a big cause for concern.
From the personal side, when was the last time you visited Canada? And when do you think the next time will be, given the border situation right now?
The first half of that question is a lot easier to answer than the second half. We moved down here last fall. And when we did, we had planned to visit home every couple of months. And we were back at Christmas time. That was great. We had planned to return again in March for March break. We had planned to be back again right about now, actually, during the summer break from the kids at school. But December was the last time we were home. We were there for Christmas. And then just when we were sort of planning our March break trip to return, the situation became that it didn't seem safe. I've written a couple times within the last week about the border situation. And it's very difficult for me at this point to get any concrete information or any information besides the vaguest kind of descriptions that talks are underway, are ongoing.
This is from the officials itself.
Yeah, from officials. Both Canadian officials and American officials haven't responded directly to questions that I've been asking them about what kind of discussions are underway about the border restrictions. There have been some experts, some I've spoken to, what they're saying is that right now the situation is very uncertain for a lot of people who have really good reasons to want to cross the border. Could we have some objective criteria, and could we have a plan in place where people could say, okay, when this milestone is reached, maybe I will be allowed to cross for these reasons, and these were the things I'd have to do. Even putting specific questions about that kind of thing to officials, the responses I get are very vague from both Canadian authorities and American authorities. They're basically, health and safety is our highest priority, and we continue to have productive discussions, and we feel that the border controls in place now have been successful in allowing trade to continue.
It sounds like a press release.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon in terms of official responses on these big cross-border questions. The important conversations are happening behind closed doors, and I haven't been able to shake loose sources who can kind of give me a heads up on what's going behind that. And from what I've been reading more broadly, I haven't seen a lot of loose lips. Things aren't leaking out into the press. So the situation then is that right now, these restrictions are extended 30 days at a time. They're set to expire July 21st. Sometime in the lead up to July 21st, everyone I've spoken to expects that they'll be extended for another 30 days. And then in the meantime, a lot of the experts I'm hearing from, speaking to, reading other comments from, are basically saying we should expect to be in for the long haul. So the political opinion in Canada is not in favor of loosening restrictions at all at this point, or any point in the near future. For Canadians living in Canada, like me, but like many people that I've talked to who maybe feel like they have more compelling reasons than homesickness to want to get back there, they've kind of settled into a resigned sense that it's going to be probably at least until the end of the year, if not longer than that, possibly a year, possibly more than that, before they get a chance to visit home.
I mean, given everything we know about COVID case numbers in the US, we've gone through a lot of this, an average of 50,000 new cases a day, at least over the past week as we record this. And that number, by the way, is also climbing. Have you seen any kind of compelling argument from an expert, from an epidemiologist, that border should open up?
The people I've reached out to, both epidemiologists, but also people who are experts on Canada-US relations and whatnot, and politicians, they're not optimistic that the spread of the virus is going to be checked in the United States anytime soon. And on those grounds, there's no sense of why you would swing the border back wide open and allow people to travel back and forth, because that is likely to enable a spread. What I have heard from people is that some of the restrictions as they're written right now are kind of a blunt instrument, right? And perhaps an effective blunt instrument, but that a lot of the ways that these things come up are being kind of arbitrarily applied. For instance, right now, too, Canadians can fairly easily fly into the United States without jumping through the same hurdles as they would crossing the land border, right? Most of the restrictions coming into the United States apply to the land border and not to air travel. And so, people have questions about why is that the case with everything else being equal?
Why are the rules being applied differently? Yeah.
If I can afford to fly down, then I'm allowed through. If I can't, I have multiple children, etc., and I'm just driving down. Okay, we've got these sort of blunt instrument rules that we've set up. They have accomplished their purpose in the short term. Now, as we move into the medium term, is there a chance to refine those rules in a way that doesn't jeopardize public health, to allow more people on compassionate grounds or on what's considered essential to safely go about the business that they need to go about?
I mean, I'm trying to picture what the reopening of the border, whenever that happens, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year, whether it's longer, I'm trying to picture what that would look like and whether it would involve immunity passports. Will it be all at once, or do you think it'll be more of a piecemeal process dependent on location or where that border is? I mean, it's hard to imagine that all of it will open at once, given what the cases in the US look like.
This is going to happen slowly. Restaurateurs I've talked to, some have said, this might be a decade-long process before the restaurant business returns to the way it used to be before, because There's going to be a long period of adjustment, and it's going to involve a lot of phases. And I think that applies directly to the border too, is what I would expect is that we had a very open border by the standards of international borders before all of this happened. And I would expect it to be a long phase-in process back towards that if and when the United States gets its COVID numbers under control and they look similar to Canada's. First you might see the definition of what's considered essential travel broaden slightly, specific conditions. You might see, as we get faster, more reliable testing and whatnot, you might see requirements for instant tests at the border.
There's the public health side of this, right, Ed? And then there's the political side of these border closures. What kind of diplomatic tightrope do you think that the Canadian government is walking here with this issue? I mean, this has to figure into the challenge of navigating what has often been a tense relationship with the Trump administration.
I mean, you could see a situation in which Trump somehow takes it as a humiliation that Canada doesn't want to reopen the border, that they're trying to keep Americans out, and that's a commentary on how he's managed this pandemic. But the sense I get more broadly is actually that Trump has, since he was elected, not specific to this situation, ever since he was elected, has felt that it's in his political interest to be tougher on the border if it's possible to be tougher, right? In cases where he can say, I've shut down the border, I've banned immigration, I've banned refugees, I've banned people coming in from China, from Europe, from Canada, from Mexico, that feeds into one of his sort of core philosophies, right? Actually, a Republican strategist I talked to recently told me, two things Trump has been consistent on since the beginning, since the campaign, is that he's in favor of border controls and he's in favor of tariffs. And so to that extent, if the Canada's government wants to keep border restrictions heavier at this point, there might be a aligning of the political stars with one of Trump's philosophies, which is that a border that's harder to get through is a better border for him.
Philosophically, yeah, this does play into the message, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the Canadian politics of it, not the international negotiations, but I think the Canadian government has no incentive right now politically to loosen border restrictions at all. Who right now are looking at numbers out of the United States, looking at stories of the United States, looking at the way the American government is managing this and saying, no way. If anything, build a wall, right? Close it down, keep it closed for a much longer time for the foreseeable future. And so that political sentiment in Canada provides a real incentive for the Canadian government, even where there's a good argument to look at refining the restrictions, expanding those restrictions so that they allow more people that would be considered safe to cross under certain circumstances. There's a political imperative sort of against that right now. Politically, it's very popular right now to say, shut it down.
And that's certainly been the status quo for a lot of the countries that seemingly have gotten a handle on this. When you look at countries like New Zealand that have very strict border controls. I wanted to ask you this one final question here. The United States, not welcome in the European Union. They were not included in that 15-country safe list travel, right? That American passports will not be welcomed in the EU. At the moment, they're not welcome in Canada either. At this moment, is it an island of 330 million people?
Yeah, and I mean, they're facing tighter restrictions from Mexico, too. It's coming from a lot of places. I think they are, but the sense that the United States is becoming an island in the international community is also sort of a bigger part of the story of the last 4 years or so of American government policy, like partly by design. When Trump announced in the midst of this pandemic that he was pulling the United States out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, it fed into a policy that the U.S. has pursued under Donald Trump of disengagement with the international community. When he talks about disbanding NATO or pulling the U.S. out of NATO or reducing the amount of money they put into NATO, a lot of that's discussed in John Bolton's recent book as well. It's about not believing in these international institutions. He's talked recently about pulling American troops out of Germany in Europe, which, feeds into maybe Russia's interests. And the result of that is not just that the United States becomes isolated in the sense that Americans are not free in this pandemic to travel to other places, but the other result of that is that the United States becomes isolated in the sense that a WHO without a US member sitting at the table, without the US funding the bulk of the dues, has very little influence over what the WHO does, right? The US is soft power. It has hard power in the form of its military and its economic strength, but its influence in the world has largely been exerted through being the most influential member of a lot of these international organizations. And the isolation in the United States is a kind of a bigger story. And this pandemic kind of puts an exclamation point on it to an extent where it's made it mutual. The US has been trying to pull out of a lot of international cooperative enterprises for a few years now and has been gradually doing that. And now the pandemic has created a situation where other countries are saying, you know what? We don't want you involved in this. We don't want your people traveling here. I think that's a bigger, longer term story for the United States, partly dependent on what happens in the election, partly dependent on what happens over the next few years with the pandemic. But a lot of times these emergencies create temporary situations that become permanent, right? In the United States, you can see that after 9/11, they changed the way they engage with the rest of the world, and they changed the way the security is implemented around the United States. They changed to some extent their definition of what's a reasonable infringement on freedom. And those didn't end after the immediate threat went away. But I think there could be potential longer term implications for how the United States engages and relates to the rest of the world and vice versa that start with these temporary measures that are implemented because of the pandemic kind of have echoes for years to come.
Ed, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this. It's odd because it feels like we're maybe just in the middle of it. Like you said, that there's so much more to come, especially looking forward to November. So thank you very much.
No problem. And, from what I'm hearing from experts right here in the United States, we may be at the beginning of it. Maybe not even the end of the beginning. So there's going to be much more to come, but it's my pleasure to talk about it anytime.
Thanks, Ed. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's Ed Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington Bureau Chief. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.